Hello and welcome to For Every Response, the podcast from Emergency Services Times. I'm Lana, Deputy Editor here. This episode is sponsored by MSA Safety.
So today we're joined by Rachel Tuffin, Interim Director of the Centre for Police Productivity at the College of Policing. And the college is a key partner at the Emergency Services Show this September, where they'll be sharing insights on neighbourhood policing and what we've learnt from last year's riots. Rachel sat down with Catherine shortly before the latest spending review was announced, a review that has now landed and, as we've reported, includes more money for policing, but still not enough to do everything expected under the Safer Streets mission. And you can read our full coverage all about that at emergencyservicestimes.com. And that context really sets the tone for a conversation about getting more from what we already have, where doing the basics well and using evidence and applying innovation thoughtfully can make the biggest difference. Rachel talks about how technology like robotic process automation can really help free up time from those routine tasks, and how tested approaches like hotspot policing and body-worn video still just take far too long to scale up. She also shares her thinking on leadership, pace, risk, and what real productivity looks like in practice. There's a really fascinating section on live facial recognition too, and Catherine recently wrote about it, seeing it in action at Oxford Circus. And she asks whether it's realistic to expect all forces to adopt this technology and what kind of national framework would be needed to support that. And of course, they touch on the challenge and the potential of the 43 force model. Rachel explains how local, regional and national parts of the system can actually work together more effectively than we sometimes give them credit for. It's a wide-ranging and really thoughtful conversation, so let's have a listen to that episode now.
Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Rachel Tuffin, OBE, Interim Director of the Centre for Police Productivity at the College of Policing. Welcome to you, Rachel.
Thank you very much.
It's great to speak to you. I saw you on stage at the City Forum event earlier this year, where police leaders met to talk about digital, data and technology. So first of all, let's find out a little bit about you and how your work at the Centre for Police Productivity.
So, I've been working in policing. I was working this out the other day. I think it's nearly 30 years. And I started out as a researcher, so helping with evaluations of police practice, working out what worked and what didn't work. And then I went on from there to really think hard about how we could get that used in practice. So I was always kind of frustrated if we did research and the results didn't get used. So I was really interested in where can I go that will help me get practice changed on the ground, how we can get people to see and use this research, argue with it if they don't agree with it, and think about how they can have some of the skills to use research themselves. So I from the Home Office went to the National Policing Improvement Agency, and then when the College of Policing was set up, I was really excited about that, because that was an organisation where they were thinking about being evidence-based right from the very beginning, and thinking about how we could help practitioners, so police officers and police staff, to, as I said, kind of use and build the evidence base for themselves, as well as kind of critique it and argue with it and use it to set standards. So we've been doing that basically in the college since I joined, and that's a while ago too now. So that's what I've been focused on really. And the Centre for Police Productivity was a really nice, what would you call it, a sort of move on from what I'd been doing, because I'd started off with create the research, then get the research used. And then in terms of productivity, what we're really interested in is how can we embed that kind of thinking in every aspect of policing. So when you're trying to improve performance, you often need additional resource, or you need to be able to find some space really to be able to improve. So with productivity, the focus is around how can we use our resources better so that we create space to improve performance. And that often takes us into innovation.
Yes. Okay. So if you've been doing it for 30 years, how has the research picture changed in that time? Are you finding that you're using it all from academic world, or are you developing the research yourselves? Where does it kind of come from? Where's the stimulus for that?
That's a really good question. So it's has developed a lot over time, actually. I would say 30 years ago, it was almost all coming from academia, universities. Over time, there's been a huge increase in the number of police officers and police staff doing research. They get interested in, studying their own areas of expertise and in improving that. We do stuff as well in the centre. Government social researchers do work in this area. There's lots of different companies as well who do work in this area, and think tanks. So there's quite a wide range, I would say. But what we've really noticed, I think, is a huge improvement. I would see it as in the number of evaluations that have been done in policing. So where we actually try and carefully measure the impact of doing one thing and not doing it in another place, compare the results, and really give us a sense of, is this really working? Is this really delivering the impact we were expecting? And then adding on to that questions about cost effectiveness. So is this the most cost effective way of doing this, or could there be other ways of doing that? So yeah, I would say it has changed a lot. And I would say the best improvement for me is the number of police officers and staff who've got involved themselves, because of course they have that huge advantage of practically seeing how those problems are playing out on the ground. And when they work in partnership, they often will work in partnership with academics and with universities. They'll be supported by academic professionals in doing their research. That makes for great projects.
Okay, so that kind of academic police angle is developed, but I wonder, have they also been working with suppliers? So I was reading a press notice from Police Now about how some of their staff had worked with an organisation called Principle One around the VORG of violence against women and girls and an app. And I wonder, is that something new, or is that kind of going on generally across the policing space?
That's pretty common, I would say, actually. And police officers and staff have always been quite entrepreneurial, I think, in coming up with ideas for what needs to change and spotting where there are people in the market who might be able to help them. I was talking there more about evaluation. So once you know what the thing is that you're doing, how are you going to measure the change? But the front end, so what's the new idea? What's the problem you're trying to solve? What new ideas could help you? And how could you go about developing those? That's often in partnership with private sector companies. Yeah.
Okay. And the Centre for Productivity. So I know that there was a review a few years ago that led to the creation of a centre. I wonder if you could just give us a little bit of background about that review, what started it off, what it led to, and then your sort of role now at that centre.
Yeah, so I think in policing, over time, there's always been scope for improvement in productivity and us demonstrating that we are improving our productivity. Because I think policing is slightly unfair in that the way the centre has to think about us. So this is from a kind of statistical and treasury perspective, is because there's no agreed productivity measures in policing, which there are, for example, in health. So they have a measure that's tracked about how their productivity improves over time. And because we don't in policing, they measure us as they do with others, so with defence and others, they measure us as input equals output, which means our productivity is just a straight line. And what we're trying to do really is to find ways both to improve our productivity and to measure the fact that it's improving. The independent productivity review that was set up by the Home Office, probably 3 years ago, is it now, was part of that, sort of to try to identify where productivity could be improved in policing, what opportunities there were for measuring it, and for being able to change that perspective and that reality, actually. Because I think if you looked back over the number of initiatives that have been done in policing over the past 20 years, but yeah, definitely 5-10 years, there have been lots of productivity focused initiatives that I think you could say I would put it like this: must have delivered results, because the additional demand that policing has faced from things like digital forensics, so many more places where they have to gather evidence from and process and use evidence for investigations, but also historic crimes that have emerged, so much hidden crime that policing's had to focus on, public protection issues, so many things that they weren't dealing with before. In order to manage those and have time to spend on those, productivity must have improved, because the number of police resources hasn't increased sufficiently to cope with all of that increased demand.
Yeah, that's interesting to think of it like that, because often with technology and the emergency services, it's about how can it help you release time in order to do the interesting things, the innovation, which we'll come on to as part of this conversation. Before we do that, I wonder, in terms of that leadership role that you have within the Centre for Productivity, how your sort of view on leadership is, and how that's developed, perhaps even in just those last few years, where you've already described this change of what the demands are on policing, and the numbers have stayed the same. In terms of your role at the college, what's your sort of approach to leadership to kind of bring all that forward?
Yeah, so I always want to understand the sort of motivations and the reasons why things are happening, and try to think about levers and incentives and how we work together collaboratively to get change to happen. So, sort of classic old kind of traditional thinking: the leader leads and points ahead, and everybody else is kind of encouraged to follow. I think for me, there are, and we've been talking about this for a number of years now in policing, there are leaders at every level in policing, and we need to make sure we recognise them, give them all the potential, the support to realise their potential, give credit where it's due, make sure that that leaders are actually noticing where is the work really being done, and point the finger to the right people, give credit to them. um, and that's part two of our kind of wider work on leadership in the college. So making sure that leadership development is all about creating the right environments. It sounds a bit cheesy, but it's so true. Creating the right environments for people to thrive. So that's your role, in a way, is before you think about anything else, it's like, have you provided the right resources, the right support, the right capability, uh, development, everything that people need to be able to do good work. And I think in the role that I've done over time, you focus a lot too on collaboration, because the college really is only there to provide support and tools and things that policing will then use. So we are not useful unless policing uses what we deliver. So it has to be all about thinking about, how do we make sure that what we're producing is the right thing at the right time, it's easy to use, and that people are sharing it and are aware of it and want it. So you're creating the kind of pull factors as well as push factors. People often think in policing about, mandating and getting HMICFRS to check things and so on. And that's true in many sectors. People tend to lean towards stick and sanction, or not necessarily stick, but kind of compliance first. Whereas actually, there's a lot to be said for thinking about incentives and encouragement and excitement and that end of it, and how much you can achieve with that. So, people wanting to grab things out of your hands first before you think about how we make them comply. So, that would be another big part of it for me, I think.
Okay, there are lots of interesting things in there. I just want to ask you about collaboration. So Emergency Services Times is very much about across the blue lights. We like to think about how each of the services is working, but also how they work together. With the college, how much are you working with ambulance, fire, and the wider world of the blue lights to create that collaborative environment to help that thinking that you've been describing?
Yeah, so it varies a lot, depending on what areas. So working in areas like mental health, there's lots of collaboration there. We have looked at more collaboration over time with fire. There are things like JESIP, so the Joint Emergency Services work that's done, MAGIC, the training that happens there. So it varies, but in terms of kind of civil contingencies and responding to those kinds of things, there's very ongoing and regular joint work that happens.
I just want to read a quote to you from an event this year, the City Forum event. It's your quote. So you said, if we are to build up public trust and confidence in policing, we need to be innovative. We need to be at the forefront of the latest evidence and research, but we also need to get the basics right. The insights shared will help shape the future of policing for the better. So how does that work? How do we get the basics right? And what is going on right now that enables us to do it? Because in my head, that says artificial intelligence. It's the thing that unlocks some productivity because it can do the basics right, robotics and so forth. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so if you mean by artificial intelligence, things like robotic process automation, so
Yeah,
there are some
I think
things,
so, yeah.
definitely some things like that, where essentially you're creating just a little worker that goes off into systems, finds information, puts it together, and produces an output, checks something, does basic checks for you. Excuse me. Does basic checks for you and produces, for example, I found all these duplicate of what look like probably one person should these records be combined. So I think there's lots of potential there. Really exciting piece of national work led by Gillian Routledge in Lancashire. So she's the national lead for that, and that's definitely demonstrating that you can, in terms of basics, cleaning up data quality, those kinds of things, you can use those kinds of tools for that. But there are also other things, I think. So in terms of basics, also in areas like neighbourhood policing, making sure we're doing the problem solving work that needs to come with neighbourhood policing. So analysing what local problems are, working out what's the best mechanisms for tackling those problems, doing that work often in partnership, because making sure that it's not, people don't just think it's about patrolling or engagement. It's actually about problem solving on the ground. So that's what I also meant about getting the basics right. There are basic elements of policing where we can do that. If we can do that and do it using the tools that exist already, that can also free up time, because good problem solving work can do things, for example, like reduce pressure on something like in an area like missing persons. So identifying where does there seem to be an issue around repeat missing persons, understanding that, making sure you're providing the right support for people who repeatedly go missing. Some of that can help you to reduce the pressure. So the most recent example was was a winner of the Tilly Award this last year. So it was about providing trackers for people who wander, people who've got dementia, for example, and being able to find them faster, and for the family to be able to work with their family member and try and make sure that they can still provide them with independence, but also that it reduces the chance of them going missing. Yeah.
I think I've seen that. Is it being rolled out in police forces? Is that already available?
It's available in some forces. This is a classic example and a classic innovation example. So it's available in some forces and not others. They've made different local decisions about what's the best way of tackling the dementia issue. And it's a really good example of where, and for that missing persons issue in particular, it's a really good example of where we could, and we're looking at it at the moment, actually, that specific one, should we be providing anything more centrally on that? Where is there a central saving to be made, or is it actually better, given that forces have different local partnerships with charities and with other service providers? It might mean that having a central solution isn't the right thing to do. And that's one of the great things about working in the policing environment, is that it allows innovation because there are 43 forces. It's also the trickiest thing, because working out when you need to centralise and it's actually the best thing to do to have one solution, it's a constant tension between those two things. Both are positives, and it depends on the context and the specific solution whether or not centralizing or allowing 43 different ways, or maybe not that many, maybe 4 or 5 different ways, is the better way of going about it.
This episode of the Emergency Services Times podcast is sponsored by MSA Safety, proudly supporting emergency services and first responders on the front line. At MSA Safety, protecting first responders isn't just what we do, it's who we are. We work closely with fire and rescue services across the UK to develop and deliver safety solutions designed to meet your ever-evolving needs. That includes MSA Bristol Firefighter PPE, trusted by services across the UK and beyond. shaped through years of collaboration with frontline teams. It also includes our growing investment in innovation and technology, from the connected M1 SCBA modular solution to our agile, fully managed service model that helps keep crews protected and ready to respond. But for us, safety goes beyond equipment. We believe in standing shoulder to shoulder with the people who dedicate their lives to protecting others, whether it's supporting firefighter charities, backing mental health initiatives, or showing up for community events. MSA is proud to be part of the emergency services family. To learn more about our work in the UK and how we're supporting first responders every step of the way, visit www.msasafety.com. With MSA Safety, when you go in, we go in with you.
And on neighbourhood policing, obviously that's a big deal for this government. It's really focusing in on it. I wonder in order to do that, whether the hotspot approach that's been brought up a lot over the last couple of years, we've seen lots of examples of hotspot policing based on data, which has helped to identify where certain activities are taking place, and therefore the resources should be there to perhaps prevent them, or whatever the answer is. Is that another way of being more efficient? But if you're using data to work out where the resources should be, so they're not just wandering around, they're very focused and they're doing it. I just wonder, is that another example of how
Absolutely.
you can be
And
efficient?
actually, you picked out really nicely there an example of what we're trying to do in the work of the centre more generally. So hotspots policing goes back 30 years, and it's taken us pretty much 30 years to get it sort of as a standard thing for policing. And most recently, for that to be both hotspot patrol, but also hotspot problem solving. So a combination of those two things being used where it's most appropriate. So because when you use patrol in hotspots, it will suppress crime issues for a period, but if you remove it, it can pop back up again. Whereas if you add problem solving to that, then problem solving will have a longer term effect. So you've worked out what's the underlying cause in this hotspot, and can I put something in place, again often working with partners, to remove that. So yeah, you're spot on. And what we're trying to do with the work of the centre, body worn video also, for example, I think that took 15 years or so, is shorten the time from when we first identify an innovation as being really good for some testing, some evaluation, or even having some evaluation, even better, and then actually pushing through to how do we roll this out nationally. And I think one of the things that we've noticed as we've been doing this because this past year we've been kind of building up the approach of the centre and trying out some of these things, is that it's often we haven't in the centre provided a set of things that forces really need. So awareness we've got much better at. So we've got something called the practice bank where we share innovations, so anybody can access it. It's publicly accessible, and we put all of the innovations that have been flagged to us where forces are prepared to share what they've done, and it's been implemented, might not have been evaluated yet. So sometimes that's the way we spot things that could be evaluated in another force. But we've got the practice bank. So awareness raising, okay, we're getting better at that. We've all got together as part of an innovation pipeline. So the collaborative bit, working together as a collective with the Office of the Police Chief Scientific Advisor, with the Science and Innovation Coordination Committee, so National Police Chiefs Council, Science and Innovation Coordination Committee. We've come together and said, right, we need a pipeline. So we're all working together on the pipeline. But then what you also need, and this is part of this pipeline idea, is a blueprint. So something which shows in quite a lot of detail to a force everything that's needed in order to put this innovation in place, including, like draft policies and things like that. So they don't have to do that kind of work again. All of that is provided to them. And then where we think it's something that really merits the support, because we can't do this for everything, we just don't have the resource to provide this sort of support for everything, implementation support on the ground and by networks, so virtual networks, events, and actually on the ground, going in, spending time with people in the force, identifying who the people are going to help best be able to help with the change, and getting that change organised with them, providing that support and the measurement of that too. So helping to put in place the measurement. So that whole chain, we've got a lot better at understanding it the elements of it, who's going to do what. But one of the critical things, and I would say this because I'm an evaluator, but I think it really does make a difference, and we've seen that shift over time in policing. It's been absolutely fascinating, is that people like having a formal evaluation. So chief officer teams now, and others, policymakers, practitioners generally, they like having an evaluation, a formal one that they can read, because it removes risk effectively, because what you can see in that is somebody has gone right into the detail. They've worked how to measure the impact, they've worked out the cost effectiveness, they've really gone into the detail about the implementation, and that actually removes a lot of risk for them in terms of thinking about, is this something that we could adopt? And I think that shift is quite significant that we've seen over the past 10 years or so.
It's interesting that you talk about this pipeline and this blueprint and the evaluation. Does that suggest then that a police and crime commissioner perhaps comes in new and will decide actually their priorities are different, that they could go to your practice bank, pick up this thing and say, actually, we didn't implement this before, but I should like to do it now, so they can do it. So they're doing it more quickly and they're having learnt from others who've gone before them and able to do that in a more efficient and effective way. Is that what
that's
happens?
spot on. And I think we were talking about leadership earlier. I think one of the things we need to incentivize more in leadership, or just recognize it more in leadership, is the courage to replicate, the courage to follow, and not always. I mean, of course, you can rebrand, and you always do when you introduce something into a new organization. I think sometimes we have the wrong idea about innovation, that it has to be brand new. Actually, you are innovating when you're bringing in something into your own organization. Inevitably, you'll have to innovate, because it won't be exactly the same as it was in the previous organization. And inevitably, I use the term blueprint, but it can't be an exact. It's not like an engineering diagram. There
It
will
gives the
definitely be.
idea of it, though.
Exactly. Yeah, you're going to have to make changes. So you will be innovating, but recognizing that as really positive. So people taking examples from another organization and implementing them and delivering results more quickly, as you said, for the public. So we've gone, you don't have to do all the pre-work. All of that's been done. You can take it and get on with it really quickly. Yeah, our ability to recognize that, praise it, notice it, share it, I think is improving, but we could do more on that, I think.
Could we talk a little bit about pace and risk, which was the other things that you referred to when you were speaking at the City Forum event? You've mentioned just now that it took 15 years to get body-worn video into police forces. And in fact, I spoke to somebody at Police Scotland last week, and they've only just introduced it in Police Scotland. So I just wonder, why does it take so long? And what have you learned over the years to try and increase that pace? Is it that blueprint you just described? Does it take national push to say, actually, you will do this? How do you increase that? Because I'm a bit worried about live facial recognition, that it will take another 15 years to get that into forces if it took 15 years to get body-worn video. So let's sort of segue nicely from pace and risk to body-worn video to live facial recognition. Are we going to be a bit faster this time?
It's a great example, and it works really well with what we were just talking about. So I would say, I would stick my hand up, for example. I don't think at the centre we provided enough support fast enough for that one. Yeah. So it's one of those examples
for body-worn video, you mean?
But no, for live facial recognition, actually. I mean, body-worn video would be the case too, but I was thinking about live facial recognition. Sorry, yeah, let's do body-worn video, but same. So a force innovates. There was no mechanism in place then to very quickly spot that they're innovating, go and talk to them and say, this looks really interesting. What support can we provide you to do the evaluation? Can we find some partner forces who might also be up for being part of the early innovation? Because one of the things that's just still slowing us down slightly is it's quite good to have an evaluation in more than one force early on. So if you can get partner forces who are up for doing that really early, that's even better than having first force, then the follower forces, and then everybody else, if you see what I mean. That it's nice to kind of try and speed that up. But with body-worn video and with live facial recognition, none of that was in place. So we didn't have a system for recognizing. We didn't have a system for thinking about how do we get the standards sorted for this. We didn't have the idea. I mean, we did have networks, but now it's getting much more formalized about, we will have networks, we will have blueprints, we will have decision making, like collaborative decision making, working with the Home Office. So is this something where we think there might be an early investment needed to encourage, and later, once once it's clear what the benefits are, there will be wider adoption. Forces will invest in it anyway, or there might need to be some discussion about where the investment comes from. But it's the process, the system just wasn't there, and I think we've all been working together to try and put that in place. I feel much more confident now. The implementation support wasn't there either, so that's been a big thing for the centre. We're quite small, so can't provide it for everything, but there are other teams and people who can provide some of that, and I think it will become part of a sort of standard way of working in future, that we've always got the recognition that you're going to do the test, you're going to need the evaluation, you're going to need the replication, the blueprint, the rollout support for the big things where you really care about it and you want to get it out there quickly. For other things, we can be a bit more open to innovation, perhaps being slightly more patchy, and maybe that might be fine, that forces pick it up when they're ready for it. But still, even there, we're much, much better at sharing. So the practice bank is a good example. There are knowledge sharing events that happen in policing really regularly, where very early on, people are sharing interesting new work that they're doing with, like, groups of their peers. That sort of opportunity didn't really exist before. And we're just much better at thinking about this process of turning evaluation and that formal kind of testing into blueprints for embedding.
And also the STAR program, so the money sitting in the science and technology area, headed up by Paul Taylor, that seems to be bringing out lots of interesting innovations, not all of which go into the public domain. Is that a relatively new concept in terms of developing that kind of inventing things quickly, trying things out, don't worry if it doesn't work, we'll move on kind of approach? Does that fit nicely with what the college is doing?
Yeah, definitely. He's been terrific at pushing that agenda, both in terms of, as you say, let's test it and let's test it quickly, and it might not work, and that's okay, which is, in fact, it's a good thing to have shown that some things don't work in a way, because it sort of encourages people to think, okay, let's take more risks, because with the right kind of wraparound, it's okay. Everybody saw that weren't successful. People were really encouraging and said, well done for testing it. So I think that's been terrific. He's also a really strong supporter of evaluation generally, so he's been brilliant for the sector. Yeah.
Would that allow you to move at pace, what you talked about earlier, in order to put this into forces quicker, because it helps with the Safer Streets mission? So you've got the drive of the politics behind it, you've got the money to support it, you've got a national function to put it out. But would the 43 force model accept that when you've got 43 individual organisations headed up by PCCs?
I think where there's a clear case, and I think you find, as far as I know, most would be supportive of it for something like that, of a program where we've all agreed there's a national benefit, testing's been done. I think there would most likely be support for that, actually, that people would recognise that that's the right way to go. I think where there are issues sometimes, it's where actually historically there hasn't been the investment in some forces, for example, in technology, in platforms, in access to the cloud, those kinds of things. So it means it's actually quite difficult for them sometimes to take advantage of things that look like great opportunities, but actually, for historical investment reasons, the infrastructure of that force means it's actually quite challenging. So that's something that we have to deal with as well, and make sure we're kind of taking forward forces where there might be historical reasons why some innovation can be challenging for them.
That's interesting. Does that take us back to where we were about doing the basics well? That actually,
Yeah.
if you haven't got the basics right,
Yeah.
then actually building the innovation is quite difficult to do.
Yeah.
Does that mean that all forces are at different places in their journey then? Is that a size issue? Is it about small forces versus big forces? What would be the reason for that?
It can be partly that, but it can also be to do with differences in where they've managed to make investment over time, or where they've chosen to make investments over time, because you can imagine there'll be different challenges for different forces at different points, so they might have chosen to invest. Also, different levels of reserves, so it's not only to do with size, but I think there's a lot of recognition now that data, for example, are hugely important to policing. And we've been sort of supporting at the centre, how do we create all of the right things in place to have a central data hub for policing? that we can all access. We can use those data to help us identify how to improve quickly nationally. We tried to do some work on homicide, for example, a few years ago. It was extremely painful. It would have made that so much easier if all of that was in place. So that's a great example of where we're looking as part of that work, us as colleagues in PDS and Home Office, National Police Use Council, what's going to be needed for forces to be able to provide their data in the way that we would need it for that kind of data hub. I think the solutions now can be a bit different. So forces keep their data, but something is provided which can draw from those and create a safe, secure place where data can be accessed for specific reasons by specific people. So it's all quite carefully controlled and contained, but it allows the data to stay where they live in forces. In order to do that, of course, we have to make sure that all forces have got the right kind of technology infrastructure. Not my specialism, but something where I've learned a lot more about it over the past year, to sort of understand, how what do we need to do together to get that to work. Yeah, and I should say, actually, I mentioned the Science and Innovation Coordination Committee. The Digital Data and Technology Coordination Committee have been doing an awful lot of work in that space to provide a better infrastructure for joint working in policing, joint purchasing, joint programs, and it's really tough because of the sort of the historical legacy. Lots of forces they have contracts that begin and end at all different times. So even trying to introduce one kind of technological innovation might seem quite straightforward, but actually it's really challenging when you've got the kind of context of the 43 organisations.
Yeah, so it's really not a simple answer, is it, of all or nothing? It sounds to me like it's a combination of sometimes you go organically and you work up, and you regionally, work nationally. Sometimes the Home Secretary just says, do this. So there's a kind of a real range of things. And also the technology problem, the complexity you've just described in terms of having the basics right, the foundations right, in order to share data. There is a lot of cleaning work to do to make sure
Absolutely.
It all does what it's supposed to, because you need that in order to build your innovation, particularly around AI type environments. So lots to do. And unfortunately, we have come to end of time for our chat, which has been fascinating and wide ranging. So thank you for that. I just wondered, to finish us off, whether you could provide one piece of advice for our podcast listeners, something that they could take away and have a listen, because we picked up all sorts of different things there. What would you like them to go and have a think about after listening to you, Rachel?
I think I would encourage them to think about what's the one thing they could do to take forward an innovation, to encourage a colleague, to help in this process. So what could you do? Might be a little thing that you can do yourself locally to innovate, or it might be something you'd share with a colleague. But what could you do to help the system to improve? Because all of us have got a role in this. So yeah, that would be it, I think.
Excellent. Thank you so much. What a great conversation. Thanks for your time today, Rachel.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks for listening, and thanks to Tom St. John for expertly producing this episode. If you like this episode, then be sure to check out other conversations with leaders in this season of For Every Response, sponsored by MSA Safety. Share the link and subscribe to receive updates on new episodes from us here at Emergency Services Times.